Hi, Year 12. Welcome to the second part of the informative section of the assessment task. So 2 videos for informative, hopefully 2, hopefully not 3. And then I'll look at discursive and then I'll look at reflective. So we were talking about what is an informative text, and now we need to actually break down the questions so that we understand what is required. We've already talked about the research and the fact that you need in-depth knowledge of what you are doing. Now, a lot of that will have happened in class. You've been studying these texts for a term now, so you should have a good understanding of what is going on in the text. But you need to have an understanding of the key idea about human experiences. You need to be able to make detailed analytical reference to how that idea is reflected in those texts. And down here, it tells us about you must include detailed analysis of the evidence that demonstrates how the idea and the human experience are represented in the two texts. Now, a couple of things that are happening there. How questions are analytical questions. It's saying you have to analyze the idea, the human experience. We've also got reflected and we have represented. This unit is a representation unit. It's that textual concept of representation that you have studied in class. So you have to remember what that means. So this is the definition that was provided to all of you at the beginning of the term about what is representation, how it is defined in the glossary by Nessa. So you have to look at it in terms of both forms of the word. So representation is the way ideas are portrayed and represented in text using language devices, forms, features, and structures of text to create specific views about characters, events, and ideas. Representation applies to all language modes: spoken, written, visual, and multimodal. Now notice this part here, the way ideas are portrayed and represented in text. That is what your question is asking you to do. Look at how those ideas are represented. How do you do that? By looking at the language devices, the forms, the features, and structures of the text to create views about the characters, events, and ideas. Representing is the act of representation. So what is representing? It's the language mode that involves composing images in visual or multimodal text. These images and their meaning are composed using codes and conventions. The term can include such activities as graphically representing the structure of a novel, making a film, composing a web page, or enacting a dramatic text. You are creating a web page that's going to represent your understanding of how the key ideas of human experience are represented in your prescribed text and your related text. But it is telling us, the big thing it's telling us up here is you need to be looking at those language devices, forms and features, stylistic features, structure of the text. Why is it a novel and not something else? Or if you're doing a short film or a film, like why that structure? What's important about that mode? What other forms have been used? What's the genre of the text? What is, so for 1984 is a 3-part structured text, and yet it's got that appendix at the end, and the appendix is part of the structure. Why is that important? What's important about that? Why is it 3-part? In the class, we've talked about the importance of that, and which is repeated through the tricolon. So what's the importance of that? Past to shallows. Look at the structure of the text. Look at the poetic writing that's within it, and when the novel opens, it opens with this beautiful language that seems to replicate the ocean. And I know your teachers have spoken to you about it in class. So if you're not understanding it, go and ask them about the actual content of the text. Okay, so that's the first thing. It's saying, how is it represented? So you need to be talking about these things here. You need to be writing your T sentences: technique, evidence, analysis. Okay, you need to have a lot of that in an information text. How is the idea represented in the text? It is represented through the flash forward of, or the flashback of, or the metaphor of, or through the structure of the text, the 3-part structure, through accumulation, tricolon, run-on sentences. Look at the word choices. It'd be very interesting to do one on violence for those of you doing 1984, and How many times does he use the word sledgehammer in the novel? It would actually be an interesting one for Pastor Shallows as well. So think about how the idea is represented, and then we have to talk about what is the idea and what is the human experience. So for this, you actually need to come down to the rubric itself. Now I've got the rubric here. I've highlighted in green some of the key points for the information text. If you haven't already color-coded and laminated and stuck to your wall your rubric, you need to do it. It underpins this unit. It tells you what you need to be doing in all of your responses. The question is assuming that you are doing all of these things. In the HSC, when you get your question, it's going to assume that you know the rubric and what's required. So it's going to assume that you know what an idea is and what the human experience is, how they are defined in the rubric. So let's take a look at that. It says, in this common module, students deepen their understanding of how texts represent. So there's that word again, which we were talking about up here with representation. So you know straight off T sentences. Get that technique, evidence, analysis in there, or the technique, evidence, and the effect of it. So how texts represent individual and collective human experiences. Now that's important to note because up here, it just says human experiences just here. It's expecting you to understand that human experiences are both individual and collective. You need to talk about both of them. Excuse me. It then says they examine how texts represent human qualities and emotions associated with or arising from these experiences. So what is the human experience that you're talking about? How is it represented? How does it represent the human qualities and emotions associated with that experience arising from it? So you can't just say this is the experience. You have to actually get to this level in your writing, in your information text, and in your discursive as well. Students appreciate, now look at these words, they appreciate, explore, interpret, analyse, and evaluate the way language is used to shape these representations. Just as in the information text, up here in our definition, it's got these words here, so too are those words replicated down here. In the explore, interpret, analyse, and evaluate. As soon as you get a how question, it's telling you to analyse. So that is if you're going to do the minimum, which you're not going to do, of course, but that's the lowest level that you should be getting to in a how question is analyse. If you want to push those marks up, which you should be wanting to do, I really hope you want to do, I expect you to, you need to get to evaluate. And where is evaluate? It's the last part of alarm. So again, this is telling us use alarm, okay? And then it's telling us to look at the way language is used to shape these representations. So you need to be looking at the language of the text and looking how it actually represents the key idea or that human experience. And then here, students explore how texts may give insight into the anomalies, paradoxes, and inconsistencies in human behaviour and motivations, inviting the responder to see the world differently, to challenge assumptions, ignite new ideas, or reflect personally. Now, this part just here, I'm going to ignore for now because that's for your discursive. That's not for the informative, that's for the discursive. Up here, may give insight into the anomalies, paradoxes, and inconsistencies in human behaviour and motivations. So what the question up here is saying about one key idea about human experiences, that those two words, human experiences, includes the anomalies, paradoxes, and inconsistencies in human behaviour and motivations. Now, to help you understand that, I got this from another teacher from a different school today. We could look at it as different perspectives or emotional responses to the same experiences, or diverse motivations, or the ways our motivations can change at times be contradictory. Other ways that you could look at it is if you're doing 1984, Winston is an anomaly. He's not following the collective. He's breaking away from the collective, having his own individual experience, and he's not responding the way everyone else is. Julia is the same. She's also not responding the way everyone else is. You have paradoxes. We've talked about for those of you doing 94, the tragic paradox of the text, that Winston thinks he's a anarchist and he thinks he's a rebel, but he's constructed anarchist. We know from O'Brien that he was created 7 years earlier, and when I use the word created, I mean that they started to change the way he thought so that he acted the way he did. Goldstein is a paradox. 2 Minutes Hate to hate Goldstein, and we learn that Goldstein is just a created thing by O'Brien. Inconsistencies. For those of you doing 1984 and talking about surveillance, for me, and Miss Gurr and I were talking about it yesterday, one of the inconsistencies is the fact that who's doing the surveying? Who's actually watching them? They think they're being watched. We've got Big Brother posters everywhere saying Big Brother is watching you. We've got the telescreens, but O'Brien's not surveying. He's being surveyed himself. He has the power to turn off the telescreen for half an hour, and that's an inconsistency in itself. But who's actually doing the watching? Is there someone actually watching? Is this whole oligarchical power actually not, is it just the people themselves in their response and their motivation to what they think is what's creating it in the first place? Is that an inconsistency? And notice the way I'm talking now and I'm asking lots of questions. I've just actually shifted into a discursive text. Let me go back to where we were up to. Sorry about that. So you then, coming down further, all of this is important too when you need to be looking at all of this, but we're going to have a look at here. Context, purpose, structure, stylistic and grammatical features, and form and form, shape, meaning. How do these things make meaning? And you're asked to make informed judgment. Notice the word informed. It's not just this is what I think it means. It needs to be informed. You can't get to understand informed until you have done a deep textual study. If you haven't read the novel yet, you've got 2 days to get it done. You need to get it done. But here it says context, purpose, structure, and so on. So context, you need to get your composer's context in there. How does the human experience reflect the composer's context? How does the composer's context impact their understanding of the human experience? What is the purpose of the text? You need to get your head around purpose because it needs to be reflected in your own writing. You need to be aware of the purpose of why you're writing. Why is the structure important? Why are the stylistic and grammatical features important? And how do all of them shape meaning? Again, this is like the how. And if you look at this, it's asking you to do T sentences and to look at how we use alarm at our school. Okay, and then we jump down. They communicate ideas. So here is your ideas. Using figurative language. So you're using figurative language, not the composer. This is also you, and that is going to come out more in your discursive. But to express universal themes and evaluative language to make informed judgments about the text. Okay, and then you use the meta language of the subject. You use correct grammar and syntax to analyze language. So it's asking you to write in a sophisticated way. Proofread your writing. Analyze, look at your writing critically. Get a friend to look at your writing analytically and critically to make sure it's correct. Okay, you need to be doing all of those things, and all of those things are coming out in this question up here when it says one key idea about human experiences in both your prescribed text and related text, making detailed analytical reference to how that idea is reflected in those texts. I hope that helps. If you have questions about your texts themselves, you need to see your teacher. This is quite an in-depth look at what is an informative text and how to start looking at how to answer the question. Okay, the next one, we're going to move on to discursive.